Welcome back. This is Repeat. We're summarizing Module 2, Course 2, Real Estate Salesperson Program by Humber. I did Lesson 1 and 2 in my previous video. We're going to be doing Lesson 3 and onwards. So basically, Lesson 2 was the seller's representation agreement. Lesson 3 is the buyer's representation agreement. It's almost the same thing, so let's get into it. There's a lot of pages you have to go through, almost 64 pages, but I found that the most useful information was on page 4, where it tells you the similar buyer's representation agreement versus the sales representation agreement. As a salesperson, you should be well versed with all clauses and components of any agreement you use it in the course of a trade. Due to the nature of representation agreement, there are some similarities as well as differences between a seller and a buyer representation agreement. Here are some of the provisions in the buyer representation agreement that are similar to the seller's representation agreement. So the brokerage details, terms of the agreement, definition of interpretation, representation, finder's fees, use and distribution of information, conflict and discrepancies, electronic communication, electronic signature, signing and initializing. And these are some of the differences. If you go to page 2, a key difference between the two agreements is that unlike the seller agreement, the buyer representation agreement is an authority both for the purchase of a property and the leasing of property. When the terms and provisions included in the agreement are compared, there are some alignments, but many terms and provisions are different. So this is how it's different. Differences are general description of the property type, geographic location, indemnification, and consumer reports. So this was one of the pages that I found very useful. And then I believe it was page number 6. No, sorry, maybe 5. So the similarities between the two are let's go to page number 7. No, that's nothing. Page number 8, nothing. Yeah, similarities between the two. So a buyer representation agreement should include additional provisions that define the brokerage authorities and to what the buyer consents. Here are a few provisions in the buyer representation agreement that are similar to those that would be found in a seller representation agreement. Definitions and interpretations, representation, finder's fee, use and distribution of information, conflict and or discrepancy, electronic communication, electronic signatures. So this was basically the most important information that I found useful. And then to summarize the whole lesson, it basically tells you the same thing. Signing and initialing requirements for a buyer representation agreement are similar to those of seller representation agreement. They can be broken down into brokerage signature, buyer signature, initialing requirements across the document, and declaration of insurance. Additional information typically included in a buyer representation agreement includes provisions that better define the obligations of a buyer and a brokerage and services that the brokerage provides. Provisions such as definition and interpretation. We've already talked about this. We've already talked about it. The buyer representation agreement will include remuneration provision to clarify the remuneration obligations of a buyer. As with the seller representation agreement, the holdover provision applies to the buyer representation agreement. So this was basically lesson 3. Lesson 3 was just telling you what the buyer representation agreement is. Lesson 4, the seller customer service agreement. So now we're talking the customer. I'm just going to skip all the way to the end, page number 53, where it's just the summary of the whole lesson. So terms of and parties to a seller customer service agreement. A seller customer agreement has similarities as well as differences with the seller representation agreement. Sometimes circumstances may dictate that a seller customer agreement may be more appropriate in comparison to a seller representation agreement. The salesperson will owe only limited service to the seller. A seller customer service agreement contains information similar to that in a seller representation agreement. However, aspects like the buyer's details, non-exclusivity, disclaimer, and the absence of a listing price are different in a seller customer agreement compared to a seller representation agreement. This is additional information typically included. Most of the additional information recorded in a seller customer agreement is the same as the seller representation agreement. So, however, provisions such as remuneration, representation, and customer service, sold signs, deposit, insurance, and verification of information are different in a seller customer service agreement compared to a seller representation agreement. The signing and initialing requirements in a seller are the same as those in a seller representation agreement. These can be broken down into brokerage signature, seller signature, spousal consent, initialing across the document, and declaration of insurance. So that was lesson 4. Pretty straightforward. And we're gonna go on to lesson 5. It's the buyer customer service agreement. It's almost gonna be the same thing. I'm not going to read all of this. Maybe we can skim through it. Let's see what they say. Blah blah blah. That's fine. Buyer representation agreement versus buyer customer service. Oh, this is really nice. So similarities are brokerage details, buyer details, effective and expiry dates, 6-month provisions or for the term of agreement, property type, geographic location, buyer's warranty, definitions and interpretation, representation and customer service, indemnification, finder's fee, use and distribution of information, conflict or discrepancy, electronic communication, electronic signatures. The only differences are remuneration, representation or customer service, and signature areas. So technically the same thing as the buyer's representation agreement. We're going to go ahead and skip to page number 30 and read all of this, see what they say. Although a buyer customer service agreement is similar to a buyer representation agreement, there are key differences between the two. All of the terms and parties to a buyer customer service agreement are recorded in the same way as a buyer representation agreement. These terms include brokerage details, property type, geographic location, commencement and termination dates, 6-month provision. Buyer customer service agreement identifies that it is a non-exclusive and not a representation agreement. Simply put, this means that the buyer can sign any number of overlapping buyer customer service agreements without creating a conflict of interest with other brokerages that they have signed a similar agreement with. As a salesperson, you will use these agreements when you are working with an unrepresented buyer. In other words, a buyer who has not entered into a buyer representation agreement will with another brokerage. An example would be a salesperson representing a seller is holding an open house for the public. A person visits the open house and decides they would like to submit an offer through the listing brokerage after explaining the service options among other things available through the brokerage as per section 10 of the code, including representation and customer service. The parties agree to enter a buyer customer service agreement. The salesperson completes the buyer customer service agreement, signs it on behalf of the brokerage, presents it to the buyer for signature. They then proceed to prepare the offer for the buyer's signature. Additional information, basically most of the additional information recorded is in a buyer customer service agreement is the same as the buyer representation. One key aspect of the buyer customer service agreement is that there is often no obligation by the buyer to pay remuneration to the brokerage. Signing and initializing. So the buyer is required to record their address while signing the agreement so they can be identified and contacted as the transaction progresses towards closing. Even though the buyer customer service is non-exclusive, it should contain signatures and initials by the buyer and the brokerage. So that was basically lesson 5. Pretty straightforward. Simple. Lesson number 6. Altering the terms of representation or customer service agreement. Let's see what these guys say. to skip through the first 3 pages. Maybe you'll find something useful. I don't remember. Yeah, this is nothing, so let's skip to the end. So to summarize lesson 6 in course 2, module 2, they talk about alter terms of a seller representation agreement. A seller representation agreement can be amended, cancelled, suspended, or assigned. A suspension or cancellation of the agreement typically must be signed by the seller and the broker of record or manager. An amendment is used when specific terms in the agreement need to be changed. When the activities related to selling of a property need to be stopped for some time, a suspension can be used. If these activities are to be stopped altogether, the cancellation is used. Cancellation is used. An amendment can be signed by the seller and a representation of the brokerage, usually the listing salesperson. An assignment is used if the agreement is to be moved from one brokerage to another, and an assignment must be signed by the seller, the listing brokerage, typically the broker of record or manager, and the receiving brokerage, broker of record / manager. Copies must be then given to the seller immediately upon signing. And to alter the buyer representation agreement, same thing, it can be amended, cancelled, assigned, or suspended. Situations where each of changes required for a buyer representation agreement are similar to those when changing the seller representation agreement. Customer service agreements, altering the terms of customer service agreements. As with the representation agreements, customer service agreements are amended when any terms in those agreements need to be changed. Customer service agreement differs from representation agreements in that usually that they are only amended as they are non-exclusive, meaning the customer is free to sign another agreement with another brokerage without repercussions. These agreements are often left to expire rather than to be cancelled. Makes sense. So that was lesson 6. Let's see if we can cover lesson 7, salesperson's obligations regarding services provided. We can cover that, yes. It's a small chapter, small lesson, sorry. So the obligations of a brokerage and a salesperson to maintain business records and retain information. It is important to remember that a brokerage is obligated to retain documents related to trades in real estate and other administrative documents in accordance with REBA. The brokerage's regulatory obligation to maintain business records include retaining all documents and records created during the course of a trade for at least 6 years. Maintaining records for other activities required to conduct the brokerage's business, retaining documents at the appropriate location. As a salesperson, you should ensure your activities do not cause the brokerage to be in non-compliance, ensuring you bring all documents related to any aspect of your relationship with a seller or a buyer to the brokerage in a timely manner. It is required. Proper document storage and retention is critical to keeping confidential information secure. Obligations to not make certain promises as inducements to a seller or buyer to sell or buy real estate. As a salesperson, certain promises that are made to a seller or buyer must be in writing. For example, you must not make promises to a seller or buyer to induce them to sell or buy a property, such as promising to retail a property, obtaining a mortgage, or guaranteeing a tenant. These promises must be documented in a written contract with the seller or a buyer to ensure the parties understand and agree to the terms of the promise. Mistakes a salesperson should avoid and leading practices they can follow while documenting relationships. When documenting relationships, it is important for you as a salesperson to avoid mistakes, such as exceeding the authority granted by the agreement, failing to carefully read source documents, failing to make sure the client or customer understands everything explained to them, and making incomplete disclosures to seller and buyers, etc. As a salesperson, you should also be aware of leading practices, such as carefully reviewing every aspect of an agreement with a seller or buyer, carefully interviewing a seller or buyer, and analyzing their needs, providing competent advice after analyzing market data, being honest and forthright at all times, etc. Recognizing the areas where mistakes can be sometimes where mistakes can sometimes happen, working diligently to provide professional service helps to ensure that you perform your day-to-day activities in full compliance with REBA. So that was basically lesson 7. Short and simple, things you should not be doing. Lesson 8 is basically summary practice activities. If we go over to module summary, so the whole module, basically they don't really summarize anything. They just tell you what you need to know. We've already covered all of this. Um, yeah, so basically they just tell you what you will need to know, like what you will learn in these lessons. So basically, didn't really summarize. So yeah, so I'm not gonna read all of this. That was a module summary. So basically, this is it, and I will be doing module 3 soon. Hope you guys like it. Thank you so much. Uh, I'll be back soon. Thank you.